Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's session. I hope that you're all fed, watered and rested and ready to listen and ruminate and debate the Congress and the Supreme Court this afternoon. Before we get going on this afternoon's session, I just wanted to draw attention of both students and teachers to opportunities, if any of those who are particularly interested in American politics, history and culture, to opportunities that are available through the British Association for American Studies. For students, there are essay competitions that you are invited to write an essay of your own choice. The deadline for that is 17th of December 2025. It might particularly help boost those UCAS applications, especially if you're thinking about doing American literature, history, or politics. And there are also opportunities for teachers to go and stay in Monticello, and which will be particularly interesting given the semi-quincentennial, which is 250 years since the American Revolution, that's coming up next year. If you want more information, visit bass.ac.uk, and that's the plug over with. I would now like to welcome to the stage Dr. Joe Harmon, who's going to be speaking about Congress.
Hi there. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I'm going to give you a mini lecture right now about the US Congress. We're going to be thinking about the Congress, meaning the House and the Senate. Okay, I want to start off with a quick question just to get to know you a little bit. So how many of you regularly follow US news? Hands up. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so you're very plugged into what's going on at the moment. And my second question to you is, do you know what Articles 1 and 2 of the US Constitution are? Hands up. Okay, brilliant. So there's fantastic knowledge already in this room. Okay, so so you do know what I'm talking about here. I'm going to be building on this a little bit and just trying to delve into some theoretical questions about the design of the US system, how it's different from our system, and also think about the state of Article 1 and 2 today, because they're in an interesting place, and we're in the midst of a very heated political debate as to how far executive power is overreaching and what the proper function of the Congress should be today to act as a check on the executive. So that's what I'm going to be thinking about broadly today. Okay, so there are three main insights I want to get across to you in this mini lecture today. The first one I want to think about is what are the origins of the US system compared to the UK system? So this is something that you'll be thinking about for your A-level, is how do these two systems compare? Second thing I want to think about is what are the responsibilities of the Congress, and what are the state of those responsibilities today? We'll briefly touch on a case study that relates to what is the state of Article 1 and 2 today, and then we'll touch briefly maybe at the end about the elections we've just had in New York and elsewhere in the USA. Okay, so now I'll start with asking you a question then about the function of the Congress as part of the US political system. So what is the function of the Congress? What do they make when they go about their business? What is it that Congress makes? Can I see a hand? Over here at the back? Sorry? Yeah, you. Good, excellent. So the business of a legislature is to generate law. So what law is, how we abide by it, who defines what those things are, these really matter. And the philosophy of law, of course, is jurisprudence. So that's the business of a legislature, and that's what Congress does. It makes laws, and the way in which those laws are made are different from the UK system. Now, like, fairies in Peter Pan, which I saw the other day, law only really exists if you believe in it. Everybody has to agree on what the law is and abide by it. And this is the core debate when we come to Articles 1 and 2. What are people allowed to do? What do the rules say people are allowed to do? And what is a breach of that? Okay, so of course, as Phil said just now, in 1776, a big event happened in world history, which is that the US did what? What did the US do in 1776? Any hands up? Over here? Yep, you in the blue shirt. Sorry, say again? Excellent, good. So it's a key moment in the formation of very good. So the US Constitution dates back from this point of 1776, and it's when the USA decides to decouple from the UK, which is the parent country, it decides to go it alone, and it decides to declare its independence from the United Kingdom. And so we can see accordingly that there is clearly a strong cultural, what we call a path dependency, a strong historical trajectory where, you know, the US system resembles in some way the UK system. You know, they're both majoritarian. You know, the experience of politics in the UK, or in Britain as it was then, very much inspired the US political system, but it was also responding to this other key historical moment called the Enlightenment, where there was this notion of rationalism. You know, prior to the idea of rationalism in the Enlightenment period, rule looked like feudalism. It was about absolute monarchies which ruled over the people. You know, we have Hobbes as a philosopher who was theorizing those ideas at the time. And so it was a very different system which we've sort of adjusted, like you convert a house. You know, if you think about the House of Lords, for example, in the monarchy that we have, we've sort of kept the husk of those institutions which we've inherited from our feudal past, but we've filled them in with democratic solutions and alternatives. The US had a different trajectory. It was trying to reject, in many ways, the premise of the UK political system. And one of the key ideas that animated the US political project, the democratic experiment, which we've had for 250 years, was this idea of how do you design a system that is watertight, that prevents coup d'etat, that prevents concentration of power, that ensures that there will be accountability and division of authority. And that's exactly what we get in the design of the US political system. We get this emerging system, which is about this division of powers, and we can see that across the division of powers across three branches, but also the way in which there's a division of power within the Congress, based on what the House can do, what the Senate can do. So that's the basic insight I have for you about the distinctions between the US and the UK political system and how they work. The UK system being about parliamentary sovereignty, that's the key principle, and it allows for a very nimble, very rapid way of getting legislation through. You know, you have, unlike PR systems in Europe, you have big majorities in the UK, you know, Starmer, 30% of the national vote share, 60% of the seats. So you can, at least in theory, there are some hiccups. You know, we've seen with Starmer and some of his welfare reform plans, which haven't exactly gone to plan. But in theory, you can get legislation through much more quickly. We see a very different pathway to legislation in the US, which is much more about consensus and a conciliatory, divided way of making decisions. Now, and that can have advantages. It can also have some key disadvantages, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so in terms of just some sort of specs, if you like, some stats about the US congressional structure. You have 100 senators, of course, for the Senate, 6-year terms, 2 senators per state, and 435 members of the US House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives is the lower chamber, so it's closest to the people, and the Senate is the upper chamber. So this is the way that it's a bicameral legislature, just like the UK has the Lords as the upper chamber, the Commons as the lower chamber. There's a resemblance there. But there's lots of, there are staggered terms in the House of Representatives. So there is this sort of very common the system of voting quite regularly, which is different in the US system. The way that the government is set up is 3 co-equal branches. We have the legislative, as we've said. We've got the Congress with the Senate and the House. We've got the executive, which is covered by Article 2, President, Vice President, Cabinet, and then we've got the judicial branch, so the Supreme Court, and that's what Emma is going to be talking about in a moment. That's what the US government looks like. The idea being those 3 branches are co-equal, and there are checks and balances between them. And the powers of the legislative compared to the executive are given in Articles 1 and 2, respectively. That's what we'll be thinking about here. Okay, I'm going to skip through some of these things. You're going to have access to these slides in due course, so do have a look. They've got some interesting ideas in them, some further sources of reading. The other key point about how the US system is different from the UK, of course, is the US is a federal system. So it divides power not just between branches of government at the federal level, and not just between the House and the Senate. It also divides power between the states and the federal government. Now, this works a bit differently in practice than in theory. We've seen a concentration of executive power over the 20th century, particularly with FDR. We saw this expanding executive over the 20th century, quite different to the 19th century vision of executive power. But there is this distinction between the US as a federal system and the UK as a unitary system, where in unitary systems, it's a top-down system. You have national government, which oversees devolved assemblies and local governments. So that's one of the key distinctions between the US and the UK as political systems. Okay, so what are the specific powers of the Congress? So we have, of course, in Article 1, outlining the powers of the Congress. One key point to mention here as well is the idea of Madisonian theory, which was integrated into the design of the US political system. Now, the key insight that Madison had about human nature was that people will try and concentrate their own power in whatever office they have. So a way in order to create accountability and a mechanism for mutual observation is to divide powers between different branches, because they're both going to try and, or they're all going to try and amass as much power as they can. And so by creating competition between these different branches, you'll create a check on them all. That's the basic insight, the animating mechanism, which is Madisonian behind power sharing. Now, these are the specific powers of the US Congress. We've got, of course, lawmaking powers, as our friend at the top said. We've got, crucially, power of the purse. Now, this is one key provision of Article 1, the congressional powers, that came into disrepute earlier this year. This has been a really exciting year for people like me who are interested in American politics and the Constitution. And I'm going to come to a case study in a moment where we'll have a look at that. Likewise, power to declare war, to approve treaties, impeach presidents, and so on. So there are key specific powers allocated to the US Congress, and there's also a division of powers between the House and the Senate. So, for example, revenue legislation emerges in the House. The Senate confirms nominations from the president and treaties. So there are different functions to the two houses, just reinforcing that idea of sharing different powers. Likewise, to pass legislation in Congress, if it's a straightforward passage in terms of passing legislation, it can be passed by simple majority, which looks like this. Passed to the president for signature, both houses passing by majority vote. If the president vetoes the bill, it requires a supermajority to pass that legislation. So you can see there are provisions which ensure that there are checks and balances in place. Okay, now one key corollary of this design of dividing powers is you end up with much slower decision making compared to the unitary system and the UK parliamentary sovereignty system. Because you require agreement between these different branches of the government and there's greater accountability, this slows up the system. And this can lead to gridlock, particularly under conditions of ideological polarization. And we've seen that build up increasingly over the last 30 years or so. There's much more polarization and fewer people who are ideologically in the center, which admittedly is more to the right than the UK centre or the European centre, but there are fewer politicians in Congress in the centre statistically. There are stronger, more polarised opinions on key issues like abortion, like states' rights, and so on and so forth. Now, we've seen, of course, another corollary of this division of powers between the branches and within Congress in the form of increasing government shutdowns, and we're in one of those right now. So we've seen these number of shutdowns increase over time, and also the duration has increased over time as well. We're currently in what's on track to be the longest government shutdown, so it's 6 weeks up to date, and there are a number of ways that those shutdowns impact the ordinary functions of government, which can be crucial to how ordinary people live their lives. So this includes, for example, food assistance, so the program SNAP, which more than 40 million Americans rely on. That's been dramatically affected by the current government shutdown. Likewise, military pay, you've got people who are working for the military while receiving their paychecks, heating, federal workers, and of course, most recently, air traffic controllers, where we had a near miss at Boston Airport last week, and it's just been announced that they're going to reduce the number of flights in order to ensure that accidents are prevented, or there's that kind of oversight with enough staff in place to ensure that there's safety. So there are real-world impacts in the government not functioning. It turns out that we actually need government to be functioning properly. Okay, so what's the state of Articles 1 and 2 today, dividing these powers between the Congress and the executive? Now, one big case study from earlier this year, which came into a lot of heated ideological disrepute, was DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which was effectively a new department set up by Trump in 2025, just after he was sworn into office. Now, and this was under direction from the executive, headed by Elon Musk, who wasn't approved by Congress, he wasn't an official nominee. Now, this was technically a department, an older department that had been rebranded as a new department, but the basic function of this department was meant to be about cutting funding and cutting personnel in various government agencies, which is normally something that the Congress has oversight of under Article 1. So particularly they were targeting USAID USAID, which deals with international development, huge source of soft power in America. It's about 0.6% of the federal budget, and also targeting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was set up by Elizabeth Warren in the Obama era. So we're looking at those particular agencies and trying to cut off their funding. Now, the way in which they did that was by taking control of the payment systems and freezing those funds as they were on the way to Congress. So that was kind of like they were looking for a sort of loophole or technicality in order to prevent that funding. So this created sort of a huge sort of political ruckus. It's one good example, I think, of exploring this question of what is the state of executive power today, and are we seeing an expansion of executive power which is unprecedented, or is there precedent? Of course, you can come up with your own conclusions to that. But I think that's one debate that's been very much in play today around the power of the person, particularly relating to that DOGE case study from earlier in this year. Now, this was called unconstitutional by a district judge earlier in this year, or who suggested it may be unconstitutional, and you can have a look at that link as well if you'd like to read more closely about that. So I think it's very much looking at these different examples which could be potentially breaches. The most recent one in the news, of course, is the Trump ballroom, which is thought to be in defiance of the shutdown, where sort of agency functions, the White House functioning essentially as an agency in this context, are meant to cease during this period. And there's also this question about whether it violates the emoluments clause as well, which you can look into more deeply if you would like. There's a citation there from a Minnesota law professor if you'd like to have a look more into that. And that's what that looks like, demolishing the East Wing to make room for the new ballroom. Okay, so what I would think about in terms of what's coming up in US politics is, of course, the midterms. Now, we've just seen Mamdani do very well, a number of Democratic wins across the board in the USA. And I think the next key thing to think about is the midterms. Now, Trump, of course, in last year's election won a trifecta. That means won all of the, both houses of, both the Senate and the House in Congress and the executive are under Republican control. So that's one key factor we're seeing. We do seem to be seeing a sort of Democratic pushback in the last few weeks and months. So the midterms are definitely going to be ones to watch, thinking about which sort of key political, lightning rods and issues are going to be prominent in those midterms. Okay, now some case studies if you want to explore more deeply. You've got a couple of examples there that show this kind of division of power between the different, the House and the Senate in Congress, and the relationship with the executive. And I'm going to take questions in a moment. Key takeaways, I think, from this mini lecture, which I know was a very quick breeze through those various questions. I think there's a really interesting question here in terms of political theory about how do you design a system that is both efficient and which divides authority effectively, and can you create or design from scratch or sort of with a piece of paper a system that can function effectively in reality? Do all systems just have their drawbacks? But more importantly, do institutions that are democratic actually reside within us as political actors, within individuals, within our social norms, within our culture, as opposed to residing in pieces of paper and institutions? That's one key thing I would make you have a think about. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jo. We are going to throw it out to questions, but before we do, I just want to go back to your slide on gridlock. Because...
Yeah, there are lots of slides. That one,
yeah.
Which I'm in that picture, but...
Yeah. Did you mean to put Jeff in that picture?
Oh, yes, you are. That's not why I chose it, Jeff.
Not very flattering.
Yeah.
Totally unintentional, but this is proof that he actually did serve in Congress. There he is.
It's amazing.
Hair club for men.
Okay, so we are going to go, first of all, to a question from Lady Margaret School. And so if you can put up your sign to show the roving mics where you are. And then after that, Farnborough Hills School.
Would it be possible to get some more water up here?
Yes.
Somewhat? Not you, Philip. Thank you.
Given how polarized politics has become, what do you think is the most important step the parties can take to restore trust in democratic institutions and fair elections?
Great question.
Trust in democratic institutions. Well, the first thing Congress can do is get back to work and actually do their job. It's tough with the procedural vote issue over on the Senate side for them to get this government funding bill through. We're seeing some bipartisan talks now. It comes down to campaigns. On the House, we're elected every 2 years. We're supposed to better reflect the will of the American people because it's happening more often than the presidential elections or the Senate elections. So we're, on the House side, we're more reflective of the mood of the nation, so to speak. It comes down to individuals campaigning for those offices to restore that trust and actually do what they say they're going to do. That's about the only answer I can come up with at this moment.
You know, that's a good question, and I was just sitting here thinking about it, and part of it is if you're going to be an elected official, whether you're the president or a member of Congress, you got to lead by example, and you got to speak the truth. You know, I left Congress in 2013 to go home, and I was the Democratic nominee for governor of Arkansas in 2014. That was the year Arkansas, which had traditionally been a Democratic state, flipped red or Republican. And so I came up short and lost that election. I didn't get up the next morning and say the election had been stolen, because it hadn't been. And yet a lot of people that follow Trump, this MAGA movement, whatever he says, they believe. Whatever comes out of his mouth, they believe. And so more and more Americans believe the elections are rigged, that they're not fair, and nothing could be further from the truth. And now all these other elected officials think they got to jump on the same bandwagon to try to out-Trump Trump. Just in my home state of Arkansas last week, our Secretary of State that oversees elections had this big press conference, said it was going to be breaking news. He had discovered that 220 non-citizens of Arkansas had voted in the last general election out of 1.8 million people. That is less than 1/10 of 1%. And yet he was trying to portray this image that all these folks are here illegally and they're voting, and that nonsense has got to stop. I think that would do a lot to restore trust and confidence in our elections in America. And in terms of the dysfunction and getting Congress to work together again, as like I said earlier, I think for that to happen, we're going to have to reverse what we're doing and what's getting worse with this next year's elections, with all this redistricting business, and get back to stop drawing red districts and blue districts, and just draw American districts based on geographic and economic interest. And that will force more consensus, it will force more compromise, and that'll be better for the American people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the other thing, I mean, it is a great question that you raise, I think. And I think it comes back to this question about political culture and where does democracy reside. I think one other point I would raise as well is that there are issues around how we access information and how we ensure that information is being generated in an accurate manner and that's in the public interest. And so that's one thing I think we should be thinking about digital literacy, for example, in all societies. It's something that Finland has been introducing in their curriculum. How do you actually, educate young people from the age of, primary school to engage with the information that they're seeing in a critical way. And I'm sure all of you are able to do that when you're engaging with media. So I think that's another point as well, is what's that informational environment looking like? Because that is key to the kind of democracies we're going to have, I think. But it's a great question.
Thank you. And can we take the question from Farnborough Hill School, please?
What's your opinion on the influence of religion on the state? And do you think Congress should be implementing laws and making decisions influenced by any religious beliefs at all?
I answered the last one first.
Okay. The First Amendment of the Constitution makes it clear a separation of church and state. And that really dates back to the United Kingdom. We broke off from the United Kingdom partly because of the Church of England and a particular religion being forced on you. And our Constitution guarantees that everyone in America can choose to worship or not worship, and if they choose to worship, they can choose to worship the God of their choice. There needs to always be a clear line that distinguishes between church and state. Because if we impose only There's a lot of people in America that would like to see us impose Christian principles on our nation. But how would they feel if it was Muslim principles or Hindu and so forth and so on? And so, now having said that, I think I'm a Christian and I'm a United Methodist, founded in England, John Wesley. Thank you very much. and it's part of my fabric. It's part of my culture. It's part of my value system. It's about it has to do with who I am. So my personal religious belief may have an influence on how I vote, but it should not have an influence on how we run our country.
Yeah, I mean, what he said. We do have the First Amendment right to worship or not worship at all. Worship the God of our choice, the religious method of our choice. And our country is made up of hundreds of different religious sects or religious institutions. You have the Catholic Church, you have Protestant churches, and they're across a multiple spectrum: Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, etc. We have Muslim churches, our mosque, we have Sikh, we have, you name it. It's a broad sector. And we have a lot of people who are just agnostic or atheist, and they have the right to do that. And so government shouldn't say you have to be part of the Church of England or you have to be, this is our national church. We just don't have that. You are seeing now like 10 Commandments being put up in schools in the United States. We have a federal system, and the Constitution is clear. It said Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Congress, that means the federal government. Doesn't say the states can't do that, because we push a lot of power and responsibility down to the states, and I think Professor Harmon did a good job in talking about the federal system. And so I don't think it's the federal government's role to tell a state that their schools in their state can or cannot do certain things with regard to putting up the 10 Commandments. But what's happened is the lines have gotten muddied over the years with the creation of the Department of Education at the federal level. Right or wrong, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying the word education is not in the Constitution. It was never a role of the federal government until modern times, 1972, I think it was, 2 or 78, somewhere in that time frame. We had the first Department of Education created. And that Department of Education was to better education in the states. And they started pushing down mandates, and they attached money to those mandates that if the schools didn't do certain things, they wouldn't get that money. That's a carrot or stick initiative. And so we had federal involvement in the school systems. And so now the schools in Louisiana are putting 10 Commandments in the schools, and it's going to be elevated or has been elevated to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has ruled that the states and those schools can do what the states and those schools want to do because we have a federal system. The federal government doesn't have a role in religion, but that's where the water's gotten muddied in recent memory. So.
Thank you. Can we take a question from Griggs City Academy, and then after that, St. Joseph's College? There is a mic coming.
Hold your hand up over there. Who was it?
Come on, Griggs City Academy. Otherwise, okay. Well, we can come back to you. St. Joseph's College.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so how are you? You good? You're like, how are you? That's all right? All right, it's good to hear. So a question for both of you. Given that Trump, he doesn't necessarily believe that global warming is a reality, what was your view on Trump's stance on climate change and, his view that's kind of it's a hoax? It's like he doesn't really believe in it. So what's your view and what should be his next plan of action? Thank you.
You repeat that, Philip? Climate change in general?
So I'm saying that Trump essentially believes that it's a hoax. He doesn't believe that climate change is, concurring reality.
I mean, Trump said it's a hoax because that was something that would incite opinions. I mean, Trump pushes the envelope on a lot of things. I don't think he believes that it's a hoax. I think there's a lot of debate over man's involvement in the climate. And then we see accords that punish the United States of America and its power generation source and whatnot. If we think about climate change globally, America can't solve this issue alone. So ending our coal generation or limiting our power generation to non-carbon emitting sources is really not going to affect global climate change or carbon emissions. If you look at the Paris Climate Accord, Kyoto, and all the climate agreements, it's been very punitive on lowering carbon emissions for America, while it's allowed China to continue to pump coal into the atmosphere unfettered. They build a new coal-fired power plant every 30 to 60 days. India's the same way. So we see these other countries allowed to continue with their carbon emissions unfettered while you're trying to punish the United States of America. And so I think a more balanced global approach, if we're serious, is warranted in some of these accords versus what I believe President Trump is saying is that it's punitive to America. That's why he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. And keep in mind, the professor put on the board earlier a check and balance, where all treaties and things like an accord, many would consider a treaty, have to be ratified by the United States Senate. And these agreements were never ratified by the United States Senate. The president at the time just entered us or agreed to sign on to it without that check on his power to do that. So there's a lot going on. I'd love to have a long, drawn out conversation about, carbon and electricity generation and global politics. But I think Trump just saying it was a hoax, to answer your question, was just an attempt to push a certain message in order to roll back to a better negotiating position.
I think we've got to be good stewards of the environment, and we should all collectively have a goal of leaving this land, this planet, as well off as it is now when we leave it. I think in America, despite some of Trump's policies, we're making great strides. There's not been a new coal plant built in the last 13 or 14 years in the United States. I work in the energy business now. We run the electric grid for 14 states across the middle of America. And I can tell you we've integrated more wind energy than anybody, not just in the United States, but North America. 38% of our energy is coming from wind for those 14 states now. Additional percent is coming from solar. But being the grid operator responsible for keeping the lights on, I can tell you the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and we see these huge shifts because it's a variable form of power. And so we have to be as good at forecasting the wind as we are the demand for electricity in order to keep the lights on, to see these events coming. So some days we're getting 35,000 megawatts of wind power. Some days it's under 200 megawatts. And it's not uncommon to see a 15,000 megawatt swing in 4 hours. So what's 15,000 megawatts? That's like turning on 30 large coal or gas plants. And if you don't have those today, then you would have blackouts. And so I think we're in an energy transition period in America. And if you really care about the environment and you're someone who believes in a carbon-free footprint when it comes to energy, then you better start understanding how to appreciate and support nuclear power, because you've got to have something other than wind and solar to keep the lights on. And nuclear is one of the ways to do it, and I think we're close to seeing somewhat of a nuclear revival across the world. Technology's better, it's safer, and I think people across the world are going to demand it. Having said that, Jeff's right. I mean, China's building a new coal plant about every 10 days. And so what is that doing to the planet? And America is a small piece of the planet. But if we truly are the leader of the free world, then we need to lead by example. And I think we're doing that. I think we're in an energy transition. It's happening, but it's got to happen in a way that's responsible so you don't have blackouts. And I think you'll hear a lot more about nuclear power in the years to
Absolutely.
come.
And the United States of America have lowered their carbon emissions more than any other country on the planet. And from Kyoto till now. So we've done it. We've done it in a lot of different ways. We're embracing nuclear. I was going to say something else, but I lost train of thought. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah. Just very briefly, I think it's a great question. I can't see who asked it, but I think it shows the geopolitical importance of the US as a hegemon. This is the world that we live in. We live in a world of superpowers. Now we live in, it seems to be a multipolar world, not just a unipolar world, which was the last 30 years. And it shows the importance of these big geopolitical actors and what happens globally for us all, I think. And just on the point on federalism, of course, try to depict, I think, descriptively how those systems are different. The normative question, of course, is a very different one, which is which system do you want and which works best. But you can have your own view on that.
Thank you. And Greek City Academy, did you have your question?
Yes. Oh, wow. Okay. Do you believe... No, sorry. Let me just think of my process. Your Congress isn't known for being really representative, both in political parties and also in gender, ethnicity, and that stuff. Are there ways that you think should solve those issues, either long-term or short-term?
So I think the question was, are there ways that Congress can address issues around gender and minority representation within the representatives so that the Congress looks a bit more like America?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should continue to strive to do that. I mean, I believe we have more women serving in Congress today than we've ever had. There's quite a few African Americans. There's quite a few Latinos, and we now have even some Muslim members, quite a few Jewish members. So I think it's more diverse than some people think, and I think a lot of that diversity actually happens on the Democratic side of the aisle, simply because, as it's been said before, we're such a big tent party.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a misconception that Congress isn't made up of diversity. A lot of women on the Republican side in leadership roles. Look at Lalise Stefanik, look at Kathy McMorris Rogers, who just retired, and numerous others. And there are a lot of different religions, there are a lot of different skin colors on both sides. I think Wesley Hunt and John James on the Republican side, Tim Scott from my state, African-American senator, and Cory Booker from New Jersey on the Democrat side in the Senate. So the diversity is there. I think it's a reflection of the nation, and we are a representative body, so anyone's able to run. There's no restrictions on anyone can run regardless of your race, religion, or sexual identification. So you've got to win, and you've got to go out and prove yourself to be the best candidate in the United States of America, regardless of any of those topics or categories that I mentioned.
Just very briefly, I think it's a great question about what does representation mean? How do you create an electoral system that looks like it's demos, that looks like it's electorate? I think one elephant in the room here might be comparing the UK and the US, the electoral finance system, which, there is this huge burden for politicians in the USA of having to fundraise in order to run. I think that might potentially be a game changer. I'm obviously here as an academic, not to give normative positions in the same way that a politician might. But I think that's one big difference between the two systems that could be relevant to that question. But yeah, fantastic question.
Yeah, let me add this, that the lady that replaced me in Congress, a female replaced me, and she's the first woman ever elected to the congressional seat that I held. So you see those transitions, and she's doing a great job.
Great, and I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So if we could have questions from Shooters Hill Sixth Form College and then Beaconsfield High School. So, Shooters Hill?
Yes. What are your thoughts on Trump potentially running for president in 2028?
Do you think that Donald Trump is going to run for president in 2028?
Say that again.
Do you think Trump is going to run in 2028?
The question is, will he run for a third term in 28?
I still didn't understand you. I'm sorry.
Trump, third term.
Come on. Really? Constitution's clear. Trump can't have a third term. He said he's not going to run. That's another instance where Trump has really push things for effect, right? He says things sometimes just for effect, knowing that we're not going to change the Constitution to give a president a third term. Congress would never do that. They wouldn't do it for Trump. They wouldn't do it for Obama. So it's just one of those things. The press, he says it, and then the press seizes upon it, and then it exacerbates, and, you know.
Yeah. But Jeff, can I ask you briefly, how do we know that it's for effect as opposed to meaning it? Like, how can the electorate distinguish between those two things? And I mean that earnestly. How do you think we can discern what he means, what he doesn't mean?
In J.D. Vance, or that Trumpisms, or?
In Trump and his statements.
I don't know.
In relation to the question.
I think he says I think he runs his mouth a lot. I think he says a lot of things that even he does not believe, or God, I hope he doesn't believe. You know, I'm with Jeff. Our Constitution prohibits a third term. I think we have the guardrails, the institutions in place to prevent it. Ultimately, you know, through some weird challenge, I guess it would rest with the Supreme Court. And even though the Supreme Court today is 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats, I would like to believe that they would stop something like that from happening.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to a broader thing, that the mainstream media, you know, yes, Trump says a lot of things. He uses Twitter for effect. He's a real estate mogul from New York, where you have to operate very in an abrasive manner, and he governs that way. I disagree with how he did it in the last term, and how it seems he's doing a little bit more of it here lately. But the mainstream media seizes upon something, and now it's a topic here in the UK that Trump's going to run for the third term, when in America that's already been passé. We know he said it, and we know that that's not even a factor, and we kind of see through some of those antics that he puts out there. So it speaks to a broader issue, and that the media really exacerbates something, shines a light on it, and stirs up emotions, and it gets everybody in a fervor over it, and then people in the UK take it to be real, or around the world, and in America we just kind of play it off. We know that was just Trump.
And by the time this term's over,
That's just Trump.
By the time this term's over, he'll be 82 or 83, and I think it's already starting to show in terms of his health. I mean, watch him when he gets out of a chair. He can't stand up without. He's got to have an armchair to get up. You'll notice that on TV. So.
But the last Democrat president, we won't talk about Biden. Let's move on.
Can I very briefly? I think there's a whole field which is maybe worth looking into called political communication. How should politicians use language, and what's the role of the media in reporting what they say, again, to inform an electorate? I think it's an interesting question. You know, I can't obviously answer the question. It's very hard to know the future. I think this question raised about, do politicians mean what they say, or this kind of very populist style of communicating with what we call political affect, engaging the emotion, which is very different from the status quo 10 years ago, which was you're very careful with your words and that kind of thing. So I think it raises really interesting questions about our politics today, and what should the function of the media and communications be, and basically how should you communicate to a demos, and should you say what you mean? But it's a fascinating question. We'll all be dialed into that, I think, for the next few years. Yeah.
Thank you. And our question from Beaconsfield High School.
So you mentioned about legislative gridlock. I was wondering if, do you think that it's a time of particularly, heightened hyperpartisanship? And, during your time in Congress, did you see any, particularly effective strategies that were able to negate that?
Interesting. Great question.
Hyperpartisanship. Mike and I have talked about this all week, how the parties, we're seeing elements of the parties pushed to the extreme, progressives on the left and Freedom Caucus and hard right, MAGA almost movement on the right, and how it causes dysfunction in the U.S. Congress. We're on the outside now, so we're looking in and we see this dysfunction, and we could point right to the problems. And we've said many times this week as well that compromise has become a bad word in Congress. Because if you're seen as compromising with the other side, then that could affect you in a primary election. And that's wrong. I mean, you can't govern a legislative branch, I don't care if it's the state level or the federal level, without compromise. But when you get to those extremes, it makes it very difficult to compromise. And so they've got to return to that in order to have that bipartisan nature that makes America great, makes Congress great to serve in. And Mike's going to go on and talk about his role as a moderate Democrat that worked across the aisle with the Republicans many times in his nature. So.
You can tell we've done this before. He knows what I'm going to say.
Now, I like this part of it.
Yeah.
Okay, I agree with him, and I want to highlight that. That's why. But.
Yeah, so, you know, you think about Congress, or, you know, the House of Representatives, 435 members. So how do you find your place and find your way and be successful and be effective and get things done? And it's not that much different than high school or college, where you have your cliques, or we call them in America, your groups. That you hang out with, and then in college in America we have fraternities and sororities, and so in Congress, people that have shared values and shared interest and believe the same way and think the same way get together. And so there were a group of us that were conservative, moderate Democrats that, in fact, there were 54 of us at the time, and I had the privilege to chair that group, and we could be effective because there's power in numbers. So a voice of 54 gets the attention of the leadership a lot more than a voice of one, right? And we were able to do that and reach across the aisle and find compromise. And I mean, we would pass bipartisan legislation back then. And for all the reasons we've already talked about today, with gerrymandering and all of that, the folks in the middle, the folks that would kind of fit where I belong, and where a moderate to liberal Republican would belong, it's down to 21 members and shrinking. And so the middle has disappeared, and that's why I think we see so much gridlock today.
Very, very, very briefly, sorry, Phil. Just to make the point, polarization is up absolutely everywhere. I think it's definitely pronounced in the States. I'd say it's been more pronounced in the States comparative to the UK over the last 30, 40 years, but we're seeing it absolutely everywhere. You know, what we're seeing as well, more broadly, is this dissatisfaction with the centre, what the centre used to be over the last 20 years. And we're seeing a new kind of politics now and a political realignment in ideological terms. That's true in Europe, it's true in the States too. So I think this trend seems to be continuing and not stopping anytime soon.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to take another short 15-minute break now, but before we go, I'd like to just give another thank you to Joe Harmon.